The clash between culture and religion is fracturing nations, a struggle between faith and family, a war between church and state. The death of Mahsa Amini ignited a revolt unlike anything the world had witnessed, a movement that would push the Iranian regime to the brink. For defying the country's strict headscarf laws, Mahsa was detained and taken to a facility for so-called re-education classes. Shortly after, she collapsed and was transferred to a hospital. The state claimed she had suffered a stroke caused by pre-existing health conditions, but mounting evidence revealed that Mahsa had been subjected to physical violence before her death. The senselessness of her passing and the regime's crude attempt to cover it up sparked a firestorm of outrage the government was powerless to contain. Mahsa Amini's death unraveled the state's official narrative and showed the urgent need for reform. Mohammad Rasulov's The Seed of the Sacred Fig explores the complex and conflicting views on reform in Iran through the deepening divide of a small family in Tehran. The growing rift between Iman, his wife Najma, and their daughters Razvan and Sana reflect not only a profound shift in societal values and beliefs, but also a deep fracture in political ideology and allegiance to the state. A fracture that can only be healed through pressure, shame, and exposure. For years, state narratives have allowed leaders to masquerade as gods, a facade that is now crumbling under the lens of a camera and the click of a button, not through military interventions at home or abroad. The film beautifully illustrates how Iran is part of a domino effect happening worldwide. This domino effect is driven by social media and the internet, revealing a global yearning for the same fundamental ideas, freedom and justice. It also shows how increasingly difficult it has become for states to maintain their power through divide and conquer rule. The film opens up with a description of the Ficus religiosa, commonly known as the sacred fig, a plant as unusual as it is symbolic. Its seeds carried in bird droppings land on the branches of other trees. From there, aerial roots descend towards the ground, slowly anchoring themselves. As the fig grows, its branches encircle and eventually strangle the host tree. In the end, the sacred fig stands alone, independent but at a cost. The sacred fig becomes a haunting metaphor weaved in throughout the film. As outrage of Mahsa's death grows and the state clings on to denial, a surge of new ideas begin to take root, disruptive, relentless, and dangerous to anyone who resists. The film begins where it ends, at the crossroads of ancient ruins and fossilized ideas. We are introduced to Iman, a devout father caught in a moral dilemma. His faith is the only thing that's holding him together, something that starts to become more difficult as the film goes on. Thanks to his hard work, he's promoted to investigator in Tehran's revolutionary court. Unfortunately, his appointment coincides at the peak of public dissatisfaction, a tension that comes to the head with the death of Mahsa. What initially seems like a blessing ends up turning into a burden. Iman is tasked with approving executions he's barely had time to investigate, and as chaos on the streets intensifies, so does the pressure for him to carry out orders without question. We are told that Iman was not the first choice for the job because those in power doubted his loyalty and his ability to turn a blind eye. At one point during the film, we are told that Iman's predecessor was actually fired for refusing to execute a man whose guilt was uncertain, making it very clear that if Iman wanted to walk away, if his conscience was really that burdened, he could have. As the film progresses, it's clear that Iman is not just driven by fear, but a belief in state propaganda, which has left him unable to distinguish between right and wrong, fact from fiction. Worse, he's come to view the public's demand for justice and accountability as a threat against their culture and way of life. While he fears his wife and daughters may fall victim to Western ideology, he fails to recognize how propaganda, both at home and abroad, has totally consumed him. Iman's fears are tempered by his wife Najma, a devoted wife and mother who tries her best to balance between two worlds, the traditional past and the rapidly emerging future. After Iman's promotion, Najma takes on the burden of preparing their daughters for their father's new role. Up until his promotion, Iman's daughters knew very little of his work. And what's worse is they are now expected to shoulder greater responsibility without any real knowledge of what his work actually involves. Most of the film takes place in their family apartment, where Najma maintains a fragile peace between her husband and daughters by keeping them apart. Anytime her daughters try to speak to their father, Najma turns them down, and at first it feels a bit harsh because after all, he is their father. However, as the movie goes on, it becomes clear why Najma is very reluctant for her daughters to speak openly to their father because his loyalty has always leaned more towards the state than the well-being of his family. The growing gap between Iman and his daughters is starting to put a strain on their marriage. Najma and Iman's room is one of the only places where it feels like it's totally impenetrable to the outside world. However, as the movie goes on, it becomes impossible to block out what's happening on the streets. And this in turn starts to really put pressure on their relationship. Rather than dramatizing the events in Tehran, the film weaves in real footage from social media to convey the fear gripping Tehran. Throughout the film, Najma makes one concession after another for her daughters, bending the rules in order to either spare them from humiliation or protect those around them from harm. She does her best to mirror her husband's authority by issuing orders to her daughters. They continuously push back by either asking for exceptions or explanation. Despite her best efforts to scare them into shrinking their social circles, isolation is not really a possibility in this environment. In trying to protect her daughters, she realizes that their safety is intertwined with everyone they know, making it impossible to protect them without collateral damage. At one point, one of her daughter's close friends ends up in a protest, and she is very badly injured and has no choice but to seek refuge in their home. Najma offers limited help, consumed by fear as to how this will impact the safety of her family. Eventually, she sends this young girl away, only to vanish without a trace days later. Her daughter's growing concern for their friend forces Najma to cross boundaries she had really struggled hard to maintain and ask her husband for assistance. And throughout the film, Najma does her best to keep the home a safe space, a place where all of Iman's values and beliefs are upheld and his worldview unchallenged. But as the crisis escalates, it becomes harder and harder for Najma to not only shield her daughters, but also uphold the illusion that the state's narrative holds any truth. The deeper issue is she has no competing narrative of her own, leaving her grasping at arguments to poke holes in her daughter's growing sense of clarity and conviction. Across Iran, young people are starting to rise up against the increasingly suffocating social conditions. What makes this uprising especially striking is how it permeates every facet of Iranian life. Schools, shops, family homes have all been transformed into these battlegrounds. No space has been left untouched, and nowhere really feels safe. Driven by fear, Najma really has to choose between her daughters or her husband because reconciliation starts to look less and less possible. The tension finally erupts during a dinner conversation between Razvan and Iman. During the conversation, Razvan doubts the state's narrative regarding Mahsa's death. Instead of addressing her concerns, Iman starts to treat his daughter like a suspect, accusing her of being easily manipulated by outside forces. He speaks of the risks she's putting them in without really specifying what that danger is. Iman knows that the state's narrative about cases like Mahsa are false. I mean, the narrative is so unconvincing, it's almost laughable. And because he's not really able to give her a better explanation, he has to resort to the belief that the state is doing it for some greater good. He speaks very harshly about the protesters, dismissing their concerns as nothing more than a desire to roam naked on the streets. An accusation that totally confuses his daughters, who are only asking for justice and accountability. They're just asking their dad, listen, what happened to this girl? And why is everyone lying about it? Iman accuses his daughter of being persuaded and influenced by the enemy. And worse, he parrots the most juvenile propaganda and believes it. He thinks that his daughter's questions are a sign that they want to abandon their culture and way of life. As the protests get worse, and Iman is approving hundreds of executions per day, he's really trying his best to cling on to anything that would justify the state's position and his willingness to just follow orders. The movie takes a dramatic turn when Iman's gun is stolen from his bedroom. After his promotion, Iman is gifted with a gun. At first, we assume that he misplaced the gun because throughout the film, his state of mind is becoming quite erratic. However, as the film goes on, it becomes quite clear that one of his daughters clearly took it. And if Iman fails to recover the gun, he's going to prison. The gun presents Iman with an opportunity to make amends with his daughters and try and reconnect with his family. Instead, it deepens his obsession with control and his need to assert his authority over them. He subjects his own family to interrogations, which he disguises as psychotherapy sessions. During one of these sessions, we find out a lot more about Najma And we find out that she hasn't been entirely truthful with her husband. There are parts of herself that she's concealed or totally lied about. Najma's father was a gambler and alcoholic, and she has spent much of her life reshaping her identity in order to gain social acceptance, a burden that she's determined not to pass on to her daughters. It's always safer to go along with the status quo than to try and fight against it. I think Iman's willingness to put his daughters through these interrogations really shattered Najma's image of her husband as an honorable man. The tension reaches a breaking point when Iman's name is leaked online and they are forced to flee to a safe house. The pressure to leave home wonderfully illustrates how deeply entrenched these divisions have become, so much so that these ideas can no longer exist under the same roof. The struggle for control over the household mirrors a larger societal conflict. Unless some form of middle ground is reached, one side will either overpower or totally erase the other. To try and come to some resolution, Iman takes his family to a safe house. On their way there, a couple recognizes Iman from the internet and starts to record his license plate. The couple not only records his license plate, but have no hesitation in calling him out as an executioner. It's in that moment that we learn that Sana, the youngest daughter, stole the gun. Sana is the youngest daughter and also from the newest generation. She knows that this growing rift between herself and her father is never going to change without drastic action. Throughout the film, Sana and her sister have quietly consumed social media content about the protests. The harsher the police crackdowns, the more determined people are to expose the truth. Meanwhile, Najma and Iman have tried their best to cling on to the official state narrative, a version of reality confined to government broadcasts and TVs in living rooms. In contrast, the counter-narrative lives online, and more importantly, beyond the reach of state control and surveillance by loyalists who support it. The safe house is such a contrast to their apartment in Tehran. This home is very worn out, filled with wonderful memories. It's also impenetrable to the outside world. They don't have service out here, and it gives Iman the illusion of power and control. Without phone service, the family resorts to this old camcorder and starts to watch old home videos when they were happier and life was great. And again, they were seemingly untouched by the outside world and things that were happening outside of their own sphere. What at first seemed like a reset button ended up being a last chance resort. Iman was completely unmoved by their time together. In fact, from the minute he enters the safe house, there's a wall between him and his family. He has erased parts of himself to make it easier to conform and uphold a lot of the state's ideals. Iman totally shocks his family with an ultimatum: either tell the truth or face the consequences. He sets up the camcorder, this camcorder filled with wonderful memories, and he sets it up in hopes of not just extracting the truth from his daughters, but recording it as well. And Iman is not as efficient with a camera as he is with a gun. When his family tries to reason with him or negotiate with him, all it does is intensify his desire to get them to submit. He is totally unwilling to negotiate. What's worse is he conflates their resistance as an act of defiance against God. When his eldest daughter decides to take the fall, Iman follows her with a camera, and the whole thing just feels very awkward because the camera has very different meanings for them. For Iman, the camera is a symbol of proof and control. For his daughters and his wife, the camera is a symbol of vulnerability and resistance. When Iman finally realizes that it was Sana who took the gun, it's too late, leaving Iman to lock his daughter and his wife in these small rooms while he goes running around looking for her. He suspected that Sana may have taken the gun, but I think he was hoping she would either confess on her own or he could kind of get her to confess without the use of violence. However, their deep differences in opinions and values made this an impossible task. What unfolds is Iman's desperate attempt to regain control over himself and his family, while his daughter learns to fight back by watching YouTube videos on how to use a gun. I believe what frustrates Iman is the same thing frustrating a lot of states. Their role as gatekeepers of information and safety is slowly disappearing. Sana understands that her father's power is entirely dependent on her belief in it, and the more she's able to resist and question it, the less intimidating he becomes. All Iman can do is shout and scream and just try and scare her to come out. And she not only escapes, she ends up actually outsmarting him and freeing her sisters and her mother. Iman's actions shatter his wife's loyalty to him, but not necessarily her fear. And I thought the chase through these old ruins, these ruins that we saw at the start of the film, perfectly illustrates Iman's state of mind. He is lost and confused. Throughout the film, Iman waged a relentless war against himself, and instead of turning to his faith and to his family, he plunged back into the darkness of old habits and outdated and false beliefs. Poor Iman has been clinging on to the most draconian and absurd propaganda to justify his senseless actions, leaving him trapped in this relentless and futile pursuit of control. In the end, Iman meets his demise not through violence, but through fierce determination. Instead of aiming her gun at him, Sana fires into the ground, an act that shatters Iman's view and brings his life to a symbolic end. Up until his death, he refused to acknowledge that his family's disobedience was a direct result of his own actions. He truly believed that Sana was being influenced by outside forces that he honestly could not name. At first, the ending felt a bit too neat. Iman dies, and the only thing left of him is his hand and this ring symbolizing his loyalty to the state, suggesting that as one battle ends, a larger war still remains. The film then cuts away to real footage of women protesting during the Women Life Freedom movement, transforming the scene into one of celebration and hope. I thought the film beautifully illustrates how long-lasting and meaningful change must come from within, ideally through non-violent resistance, and not from outside forces seeking to exploit their resources and leave them destitute abroad. Nejma assumes that her daughters are acting out of ignorance, that if they truly understood how coercive the state was and how loyal their father was to it, they would realize the risk that they're putting themselves in and their family. Yet what she mistakes for ignorance is actually a sign of sharp intellect and awareness of the consequences that can occur if they just blindly follow what they are told. Razvan and Sana have tried their best to understand and question the world around them, only to be met with hostility and aggression. The film, I think, beautifully uses Mahsa's death to illustrate why change is inevitable and how those who try to maintain the status quo face their own downfall. Mahsa's death was an injustice that triggered Iranian youth to not just question their reality, but fight for their future, a future they were unwilling to risk by remaining silent and doing what they're told. I believe this movie conveys an urgent need for change and adaptability. It serves as a warning to states, not so much their people, who are fully aware of the danger and willing to risk their lives, choosing to fight and die rather than wait to be invaded, erased, or lose all sense of themselves. And so overall, I highly recommend this film. If you've seen it, please let me know, and until next time.